Dexter Fletcher. He's not exactly a household name, but to you, he may be a familiar one. He started out with acting in the 1970s with roles in The Elephant Man and Band of Brothers. He later branched out into directing, starting with 2012's Wild Bill, and directed a handful of films throughout the decade. Ooh, who's this guy? Because of his work executive producing a certain biopic, he was eventually selected to do that again with a different film about Elton John. This would become, of course, Rocketman. It would also become Dexter Fletcher's most acclaimed and successful film, but in my opinion, it's still extremely underrated. Shamefully underrated. Criminally. Rocketman is a biopic, which is not the most beloved or respected genre of film, and Rocketman tends to get compared to a lot of other biopics, especially a certain biopic that I am not talking about again. In fact, I'll even blur out the poster. By the way, I wouldn't say that you have to watch my video on that certain biopic to understand this video, but it would help. Think of that video as episode 0 for this entire series. And I also just want you to watch it because I think it's the best video I've ever made by far. If you're going to watch just one part of it, watch part 8, it's the most important. Rocketman is a fantastic film, and it didn't and still doesn't get the recognition I feel it deserves. And we're going to find out why in today's episode of Criminally Underrated Media. Welcome to the very first episode of Criminally Underrated Media, a brand new series here on my channel where I discuss the movies, shows, books, and albums that are, in my opinion, criminally underrated media.
Obviously, the acronym being CUM.
Today we'll be taking a look at Dexter Fletcher's 2019 film, Rocketman. This movie is, of course, about the legendary life and career of Elton John, his childhood, his meteoric rise to fame, and his personal struggles. Elton is played by none other than Taron Egerton, who I talk about so often on this channel, you'd think I was like in love with him or something. Rocketman was released in 2019, but it had been in production for almost 20 years before liftoff, and I could explain this production process to you, perhaps in some sort of brief timeline, but I'm not going to. There are, however, a few things worth noting. I've mentioned this before, but Elton John himself was heavily involved in the film, and so was his husband, David Furnish. The project initially ran into trouble because a majority of studios wanted a family-friendly PG-13 rated film, and Elton was insistent that the film be rated R. There were also a couple of actors who were supposed to star as Elton but didn't for one reason or another. For example, Justin Timberlake was originally supposed to play Elton, and every day I wake up and thank God he didn't. Tom Hardy, no relation to Ben Hardy, was later cast in the role, but dropped out because Elton wanted an actor who could actually sing, because he didn't believe a biopic in which the main actor was constantly lip-syncing would ever be successful. Today, it's hard to imagine anyone other than Taron Egerton playing Elton John. What's interesting is that Taron actually had a long-running history with Elton and his music before he was cast in the film. When he first auditioned for the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, he sang Your Song. He sang another Elton John song, I'm Still Standing, as part of his role as Johnny the Gorilla in the film Sing. Have I made a single video without mentioning some kind of gorilla? And outside of Rocketman, Taron is probably best known for his breakout role as Eggsy in the two Kingsman films, The Secret Service and The Golden Circle. Do you know who else was in Kingsman: The Golden Circle? Elton John! The Kingsman films were directed by Matthew Vaughn, and while The Golden Circle was in post-production, Vaughn discovered that a film was being made about the life of Elton John. He agreed to produce the film on one condition, that Taron Egerton play Elton John. Matthew Vaughn also chose the film's director, Dexter Fletcher, who had previously worked with Taron on his film Eddie the Eagle. And now I would like to take a moment to go on a brief tangent about Eddie the Eagle! Okay, I know the last brief tangent I went on was like 15 minutes long, but I promise you this one actually is brief. I don't have that much to say. For context, Eddie the Eagle is another biopic about the famous skier Michael Edwards, directed by Dexter Fletcher and starring Taron Egerton.
Hugh Jackman's house, it's got a lot of poo.
Brilliant.
Hugh Jackman, if you will.
Yeah, no, he's covered in shit.
Poop Jackman.
Jackman.
This film is worth talking about for 4 reasons. First of all, like I mentioned, Dexter and Taron worked together on this film before working together on Rocketman. Second of all, Eddie the Eagle was also produced by Matthew Vaughn. Third of all, in this film, one of Taron's co-stars is none other than Edvin Endre, who played Snufkin in Moomin Valley, so Taron and Edvin worked together on this film before working together on Moomin Valley. And fourth of all, Taron recorded a song for this movie, Thrill Me, which I believe was his first time singing as part of an acting role. And this song is great! The soundtrack of the film is composed of original songs from a bunch of 80s artists, including my all-time favorite 80s band, Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark. I grew up listening to this band, I still love their music, and when I found out that OMD had a song with Taron Egerton, I was so excited and I knew I had to tell someone about it, so I figured I would tell you. This concludes a brief tangent about Eddie the Eagle. See, that wasn't so bad. So you may have noticed that we're starting to see the formation of a bit of a team. Dexter Fletcher, Matthew Vaughn, and Taron Egerton are all frequent collaborators, and by frequent I mean it happened like twice. But this isn't the only example. Bryce Dallas Howard, who plays Elton's mother in Rocketman, later starred in Argylle, which was directed by Matthew Vaughn. You may remember Argylle for being like the worst movie ever made, at least until Madam Web came out. I just think it's kind of interesting that these people continually work together and support each other, and how Dexter Fletcher and Matthew Vaughn were both so invested in elevating Taron's career. In hindsight, Taron's role as Elton John was obviously a major career boost, but I don't think people realize how much of a lifesaver this role was, because it was not looking good for him. At the time, his 2 most recent projects were starring roles in Robin Hood and Billionaire Boys Club. Oh no. Oh no! Robin Hood especially was set to make him a star, except it didn't because it was awful and completely killed whatever momentum his career had. In fact, his only other acting credits in 2019 were voice roles in The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance and in Moomin Valley. And I would bet you $1,000. Actually, I don't have that kind of money. I should choose a price everyone can afford. I would bet you $5.99 that if Taron hadn't gotten the role of Elton, if his career hadn't taken off again, he would probably still be voicing Moomin Troll today. While there was a lot of turnaround in terms of possible directors and lead actors, one position that never changed hands was that of screenwriter. Rocketman was written by Lee Hall, who I'm not too familiar with. Let's see what else he wrote. What the hell? You know what, that's actually an interesting coincidence because Tom Hooper, who co-wrote and directed Cats, was actually supposed to direct a certain biopic about a certain band. And the remaining members of that band, who were heavily involved in the film, didn't want Hooper in the director's chair. I'm not sure why, but I'm sure whoever they did go with was definitely the right choice. I know it seems like I just told you a bunch of useless information, and that's because I did, but really it's just because I want to make the point that yes, Rocketman had an extremely long and kind of messy production, but this process did not in any way hurt the film or make it worse, because we've seen that happen before. Rocketman premiered at the Cannes Film Festival on May 16, 2019, and was released theatrically on May 22, 2019, nearly 5 years ago. It was a commercial success, grossing nearly $200 million at the box office against a budget of just $40 million. But more importantly, critical response to the film was extremely positive. While some criticized it for being another formulaic by-the-book biopic, Rocketman was very positively received by both critics and audiences. Despite this positive reception though, it had limited success at award season, specifically the Oscars, and I could explain this limited success to you, perhaps in some sort of brief tangent, but I'm not going to. I will a little. Taron Egerton won a Golden Globe for his performance, rightfully so, but he wasn't nominated for an Oscar, and Rocketman as a film only scored 1 nomination for Best Original Song, which it did win. If I had a nickel for every time one of my favorite movies, with a title starting with the letter R, won the Oscar for Best Original Song and deserved to be nominated for way more Oscars, I would have 8.35 rupees. Obviously, winning 1 Oscar is better than winning no Oscars. I wish the movie had gotten recognition from the Academy, but I'm not too upset. Besides, from what I've seen, they'll just hand those things out to anybody. At this point, it may not seem like Rocketman could really be considered underrated. It was obviously very successful. but it wasn't nearly as successful as other films from the same genre that are much, much worse. And I don't think that's fair. Rocketman tends to get treated like every other stale, standard musical biopic, but it's so much more than that. What makes Rocketman so great is its originality. It's part of a genre which is rife with cliches and contrivances and formulas, but Rocketman breaks that mold in so many ways. It's visually striking, emotionally moving, and so much more meaningful than your standard musical biopic. There are so many creative and clever choices that this movie makes that really elevate it above any of its contemporaries. The most obvious example is the music. Rocketman is not just a movie about music, it's a jukebox musical. This is, in my opinion, a brilliant choice and also a huge risk for the movie to take. Lots of people don't like musicals. I, for the most part, don't like musicals, and while biopics about musicians are a dime a dozen, very rarely does a musical biopic treat its songs like in-universe musical numbers. Obviously, these biopics will inevitably feature a soundtrack composed of their subject's greatest hits. There's a pattern these movies tend to follow through which we get to see how these musicians came up with their most famous songs. They write the song, they perform the song. They write the song, they perform the song. They write the song, they perform the song. You get it. Rocketman only does this with 3 songs: Border Song, Your Song, and kind of I'm Still Standing. The rest of the Elton John songs featured in the film are musical numbers sung by the characters that progress the plot forward. The music is used to further the story, not the other way around. This also means that the songs were completely re-recorded with all new instrumentation, and to make the soundtrack feel more cinematic, a lot of these songs got beefed up for the film. For example, the original version of Saturday Night's All Right for Fighting sounds like this. But in the movie, it sounds like this. There was also an original song written for the movie, I'm Gonna Love Me Again, which won the Oscar for Best Original Song. I really like this song. I think lyrically it complements the themes of the movie really well, and I just think it's really cool to hear Elton John singing a duet with the actor playing him. Also, the way Taron sings the word kryptonite is so crazy. And with the exception of that song, which plays during the ending credits, at no point in the film do you ever hear Elton John's real voice, which is another huge risk for a movie like this to take. When audiences go to see a movie about Elton John, they want to hear Elton John's voice, or an actor doing a voice that is just like his.
They pay to see Elton John!
They don't want to hear some guy, but Taron Egerton is doing all of the singing you hear in the film. For your benefit, I've put together a compilation of my personal favorite bits. And look, I'm not knocking actors who lip sync in their movies. Honestly, I think it's much better for an actor to lip sync than to try to imitate an iconic voice and fail miserably. Taron Egerton is a fantastic singer. He sounds nothing like Elton John, but he's also not really trying to. In fact, Elton himself told Taron not to copy him and find his own take on the character and on the music, and I love it. It makes this version of Elton feel like his own character and makes the soundtrack feel so much more authentic. Elton himself said that no one can sing his songs like Taron can, and while I think George Michael still holds the crown for best Elton John cover, he's still right. Nobody can sing these songs the way that Taron does. The fact that Taron is singing all of these songs also means that this is just as much an acting performance as it is a singing performance. If you listen to the soundtrack on its own, completely divorced from the actual movie, you can still feel the emotions of each scene without seeing them because of the way Taron sings each song. There are bits where he's clearly angry or excited, or he's on the verge of tears. Like, look at this video of him recording Benny and the Jets. He looks like his face is trying to escape his head. There's a bunch of behind-the-scenes footage of Taron recording these songs, and he's clearly giving it everything he's got, giving it 100,000%, and look at the shirt he's wearing! And they didn't have to do any of this. A lesser film would have just used the pre-existing music and called it a day, but Rocketman doesn't do that. It goes the extra mile, and the film is so much better because of it. Rocketman also has some really remarkable visuals. Dexter Fletcher directs the fuck out of this movie. I wish he would make more films like this instead of whatever the hell Ghosted was. The musical numbers especially have these long continuous takes and big moving set pieces. It's like the ending of La La Land, but a little bit less sophisticated. The entire honky cat sequence is a great example of this. This might be one of my favorite scenes ever in any movie. It's so much fun. Also, the way Taron sings the word magazines is so crazy. And outside of the musical numbers, there are a ton of super creative and interesting shots and sequences. You really have to see it to know what I'm talking about. And although Rocketman is, in my opinion, a very well-directed and well-written film, it's at least partially carried by its lead performance. I know I've said this before, but Taron Egerton's performance as Elton is really good, and it's another one of those things that just has to be seen to be believed. Playing a figure like Elton John is undoubtedly a Herculean task, and he knocks it out of the park. He just has this really captivating physicality, and he's able to thread the needle of throwing tantrums and having emotional outbursts without coming across as too stereotypically flamboyant. And there are several scenes of him just silently reacting to dialogue from other characters that are just so good. And I really appreciate the way he approached this role. He clearly has a lot of respect for Elton and his story. He said before that he feels a certain responsibility to the gay community as a straight actor playing the role of a gay man and queer icon.
But just because I'm not gay doesn't mean that it's not an important issue to me. So the responsibility is huge, and the way we approached it was that we were going to try and treat the significant male relationship in the movie with tenderness and consideration, and I hope that the LGBTQ community approve of it.
I know there's kind of a debate about who can play which roles, and in this situation I don't think it's really my place to comment on that, but all I'm going to say is that Taron did a great job playing a gay man. Twice. He also underwent a bit of a physical transformation for the role. He pierced his ear because throughout the film he's wearing an earring that the real Elton gave to him. He gained weight and shaved back his hairline so much that after filming was done, he just shaved his entire head, which is why pretty much anytime you see him in interviews and stuff immediately after filming, he's wearing a little hat. And while he doesn't look exactly like Elton John, there are some scenes in this movie where the resemblance is uncanny. The casting of his younger selves is also insane. Also, his teen self is played by Kit Connor from Heartstopper, which has got to be relevant to someone watching this. And also, I have to point this out, there are so many people in this cast that look like other people, and not necessarily the people they're playing. Bernie Taupin is played by Jamie Bell, who reminds me of Tom Holland. Elton's father Stanley is played by Stephen McIntosh, who reminds me of Phil Cornwell. Kiki D is played by Rachel Muldoon, who reminds me of Nicole Raffi. Ray Williams is played by Charlie Rowe, and I don't know who he reminds me of. At first, I thought it was Andrew Dismukes, but I don't think that's it. I think he just looks familiar to me because he looks like Danny Gonzalez, Drew Gooden, and Curtis Connor all kind of smushed together. And if we're talking about the cast, I have to talk about Bryce Dallas Howard's performance because it is so bizarre, and I don't know if I mean that as a compliment. It is so over the top and campy. She's looking camp right in the eye. I understand where she's coming from because we're supposed to be seeing these characters the way Elton does. Elton in real life did not have the best relationship with his mother, so it makes sense that he would see her as almost cartoonishly awful. This might be too niche of a reference, but her performance here has the same energy as the sexy evil mom witch lady from Escape from Tomorrow.
Haven't you ever had a fantasy, Jim?
It's a bit strange, but it's fun to watch. I honestly think out of everything, Rocketman's story is probably its weakest element, but that does not mean it's bad. Let me explain. As someone who doesn't actually know all that much about the real Elton John, the story of the film is genuinely so fascinating to me. While it definitely does follow the same formula that a lot of other biopics do, it uses this formula in a very unique way. Also, it wouldn't be fair for me to ignore the fact that this movie is not at all historically accurate, and I could explain these historical inaccuracies to you, perhaps in some sort of bonanza, but I'm not going to. And I know it's hypocritical of me to give Rocketman a pass when I was previously so harsh on a certain biopic, but I think there's a big difference between the two. Rocketman does not present itself the way a typical biopic does. It's not a simple retelling of a true story. It's the story of Elton John as told by Elton through the lens of his wild imagination. We're not supposed to be seeing these people and these events the way they really were. We're supposed to be seeing them the way he did. The entire movie is wearing a big pair of rose-colored glasses, and those glasses are huge and covered in feathers and diamonds, okay? My point is, Rocketman plays fast and loose with the true events it's based on, but it doesn't try to misconstrue these events to sell you a story that didn't happen, or to present its protagonist as someone he wasn't, because we've seen that happen before. When you watch Rocketman, it's clear that the people behind this movie really cared about what they were making. Rocketman pays an insane amount of attention to detail. There are a ton of little details in this movie that I am dying to tell you about, but I can't really do that without spoiling the movie. Ultimately, my goal with this series is to get you to watch or read or listen to whatever it is I'm talking about, so it would make logical sense to avoid spoilers, but in this section of the video, there's just no way around it. Honestly, if you haven't already seen the movie, everything I'm about to say probably won't make any sense anyway. Hopefully by now I've convinced you to watch Rocketman, because I really think you should, as soon as possible. You can click off this video and watch it right now, I won't be mad, as long as you come back and finish the video afterwards. You get to watch an awesome movie, and I get 2 views on this video. We both win. So, to be clear, this next section contains spoilers. Please skip to this timestamp if you haven't seen the movie yet. I'm going to start at the very beginning. Rocketman opens, as many films do, with several minutes of opening logos. I'm not bringing this up to complain about the logos, I'm not CinemaSins. The reason I'm bringing this up is to draw your attention to the score. Rocketman has an original score, which is one of its best and most overlooked attributes. Listening to this opening track, I'm already tearing up and the movie hasn't even started yet. Can we get a cry counter going? The movie uses these cinematic, orchestral renditions of Elton John songs as leitmotifs for different characters and their relationships. Rocketman, the song, represents Elton. It plays throughout his childhood and during his more introspective moments. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, Tiny Dancer, and Border Song all represent Elton's friendship with Bernie. We hear Border Song when they first meet, Tiny Dancer when they start to drift apart, and Goodbye Yellow Brick Road when Bernie asks Elton to take a break with him, and during their big confrontation, obviously. I Want Love represents Elton's relationship with his parents. After it's performed as an in-universe musical number, it comes back when Elton visits his dad and when he comes out to his mother. Another great example of the score is in this scene. When Elton apologizes to Renata, the song we hear in the background is a rendition of Sorry Seems to Be the Hardest Word, which leads directly into Elton's confrontation with his mother. It's so good. The costume design of this movie is bonkers. Not only are there a ton of extremely detailed and accurate recreations of real outfits and costumes Elton John wore, but there are a few original pieces that are so creative and clever. For example, there's the outfit Elton's wearing during the Goodbye Yellow Brick Road sequence, where each part of the outfit is meant to reference a different character from The Wizard of Oz. He has a straw hat for the Scarecrow, a metallic blue suit for the Tin Man, a fur coat for the Cowardly Lion, and a pair of ruby red shoes for Dorothy. There's also the devil costume he's seen wearing throughout the film. It's obviously meant to represent the way he perceives himself, but the silhouette of it is very obviously inspired by Elvis, who was a huge inspiration to Elton. And the shape of the wings create the outline of a heart, and the glasses are heart-shaped, which reiterates the fact that Elton, at his core, is desperate to be loved. And on my most recent rewatch, I noticed that I'm pretty sure he's wearing a ring on every single one of his fingers except his ring finger. And he slowly loses this costume over the course of his stay in rehab, changing into a very simple robe and then a tracksuit with his name bedazzled on the back. It's like a compromise of an outfit. And pieces of the devil costume start falling off as he walks into rehab, symbolizing the destruction of his facade, because it's implied in the film that Elton doesn't even really like wearing these huge elaborate costumes. He just feels like he has to keep upping the ante as part of his stage persona. Also, during the Sorry Seems to Be the Hardest Word scene, Elton is wearing a very similar suit to the one he wore during his performance at Live Aid, even though Live Aid itself is never mentioned. I wonder why. Even the makeup in this movie is impressive. The movie covers several decades, and the old age makeup they use on Elton's parents is mostly pretty good. And look at adult Elton at the beginning of the movie versus the end. That's kind of crazy. I love the way Rocketman is written. There are so many neat callbacks and parallels. For example, the phrase "I love you" is only said 2 times in the movie, and both times it's said by Bernie to Elton. And when Elton is a kid and he asks to get an Elvis-style haircut, his mother tells him to enjoy it while it lasts, because everyone in her family has gone bald by their 20s. Later in the film, when Elton and Bernie's careers take off, Elton says it'll never last, and Bernie tells him to enjoy it while they can. It's such an interesting difference in perspective between Sheila and Bernie, and a great way to show the lasting impact Sheila had on Elton's perspective. This also manifests through Elton's fixation with his hair, which we see throughout the movie. He's very protective of it because his mother made him terrified of going bald. And the scene in the phone booth where Elton comes out to his mother is genius. When she picks up the phone and he says, "It's me," she doesn't say hello or anything like that. She says, "I know who you are." She knows her son, and she already knows what he's about to tell her, what he thinks is a secret. I also love the detail of her watching Liberace on TV, another famous pianist who is widely thought to be gay. The dialogue in this scene is written to be ambiguous and to be open to interpretation. When Sheila tells him that he's choosing a life of being alone forever, is she referring to his sexuality or his increasingly self-destructive and isolating habits? By the way, I'm so sorry, but the scene where Elton chooses his stage name is unforgivably stupid. It's such an overused trope which makes no sense because in the context of the film, Elton is never shown to have any kind of attachment to the Beatles or John Lennon, although they are referenced in the film several times. Also, Elton John and John Lennon eventually became real-life friends, which would have been a cool thing to include in the movie. This movie doesn't even mention any of his famous friends like John Lennon, Freddie Mercury, Princess Diana, Eminem, Dua Lipa, 2D. I'm guessing those last 3 will be covered in the sequel. The Hercules montage is also super goofy and is unfortunately another cliche that the movie falls into. It's so cheesy and conventional that it's almost funny. Depending on how you look at it, that might actually be a good thing because the movie itself is not that funny. Well, it's a little bit funny. There are a few lines that are pretty great.
Did being married make you happy?
Not really, I'm gay.
I especially love this scene where Elton's mom says, "You remember the Andersons?" And Elton says, "Ah, yes, the Andersons," with the tone of someone who absolutely does not remember the Andersons. The movie just chooses not to actively tell jokes that often, but when they do, they're pretty good. I mentioned that I thought the film was well written, and I definitely do, but I found a copy of an earlier version of the script online, and there are some things in that version that I think I like better than what we got.
I love it. Best thing I've heard since Let It Be.
In the original script, that line was supposed to be "best thing I've heard since Maxwell's Silver Hammer," which I wish they kept because that's so funny. Don't get me wrong, it's clearly a rough draft and the final version is much better overall, but I really like certain parts of it. Firstly, I really like the distinction between Elton and Reggie as 2 separate characters, which I would assume the final script does as well, but more notably, I really like this early version of the tiny dancer scene. In the film, you'll remember, we see Bernie leaving Elton by himself at a party to go to the teepee with a woman named Heather. Side note about Heather, I like that this character is a presumably fictional composite of a number of real girlfriends Bernie had, and she's named after his current wife. Also, I think she might be one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen. Anyways, the tiny dancer scene is very different in the original script. Instead of interweaving scenes of Bernie and Heather together and Elton by himself, the early script has this really neat parallel where we see Bernie and Heather in bed together and Elton in bed alone. It really drives home the loneliness the scene is supposed to convey. I understand why they changed it though, because the movie flows a lot better when Elton meets John Reed at the party directly after the tiny dancer scene. And this initial meeting between Elton and John Reed is great. There's a really cool reference to A Streetcar Named Desire and some great foreshadowing.
We can all see you shooting light and color and magic into the night sky.
Speaking of, I know this scene is kind of controversial, and to be frank, I think that's just ridiculous. I think it's awesome that this scene marks such a milestone in film, with it being the first ever gay sex scene in a film by a major studio. I just wish it didn't take until 2019 for that to happen. But the scene itself is much more reserved and romantic than you might expect, and I really like that about it. And I'm so obsessed with the look on Elton's face at the very end. It's kind of similar to the way he reacts to his first kiss earlier in the movie. He looks so love-struck and over the moon, and in this scene, he looks like he just can't believe that something like this could happen to him. And then we have Honky Cat. This is one of several scenes in this movie that I just have to break down start to finish. I love everything about this whole sequence. I love that it starts out with Elton and John Reed making out in a closet.
What do you want, Elton? Oh, dinner with you.
I love that they've turned the song into a duet where Elton and Reed are finishing each other's sentences. I love that this movie uses the song's lyrics about a redneck leaving his farm to live in the city as a metaphor for fame. I love that it ends with Elton and Reed looking into a dollhouse where the next scene takes place. It's awesome. At one point during the number, when Elton and Reed sit down at this table, you can see a couple arguing in the background that look a lot like Bernie and Heather. This is such a neat detail because we can start to see Elton becoming more and more oblivious to Bernie and his struggles as he becomes more and more famous and successful. We also start seeing some immediate red flags from John Reed when he starts flirting with the waiter. I have to say though, the way Rocketman treats John Reed is kind of interesting. A lesser film would have framed Reed as solely responsible for pulling Elton into a life of drug and sex addiction that alienates the people closest to him and ultimately leads to his downfall. But Rocketman kind of does that too. From what I can tell, John Reed wasn't the villain that Rocketman makes him out to be, which is kind of an unfortunate choice for the movie to make because it never really needed a villain. But at the end of the day, it's Elton who makes the choices that lead him into addiction. There's no one holding his hand and leading him through the club. He chooses to dive in head first. But more on that later. I'm still not done talking about Honky Cat. This sequence not only plants the seeds for future conflicts that Elton will have with both Bernie and John Reed, but it also sets up my favorite storytelling device in the whole movie, the use of fireworks, rockets, and space as a metaphor for addiction and self-destruction. During the Honky Cat sequence, when Elton snorts cocaine for the first time, we hear the sound of a firework taking off, and this metaphor is obviously continued in the Rocketman scene. First of all, I love the way they adapted this song for the film, especially the changes to the lyrics. The changes from I'm gonna be high to you're gonna be high, and from I miss my wife to I miss my life, is such a simple yet effective way to make the songs fit the story just a little bit better. Because besides that, the lyrics match up so well in all of these musical numbers, but especially this one. Rocketman, the song, is about a man reflecting on his life while up in space. He's so far removed from his home planet and his old life. The chorus is about how it's going to be a long, long time before he can go back to Earth, and when he does, he won't be the same person he was before. And this scene is about Elton reflecting on his life while stuck in this cycle of addiction and self-destructive tendencies. He's so far removed from himself and his old life. He's coming to terms with the fact that it's going to be a long, long time before he's able to break this cycle and get better. It's clear from the beginning that Elton is someone who really struggles with self-hatred that stems from his upbringing and is further exacerbated by his current circumstances. And to cope with this self-hatred, he develops a myriad of coping mechanisms that only harm him further, trapping him in this torturous cycle. And in this scene, we see the characters around him forced to recognize this conflict. I know I was kind of making fun of Bryce Dallas Howard's performance, but her reaction in this scene gets me every time. Despite the way she's treated him up until this point, and will continue to treat him after this point, the way she cries out for her son is so heartbreaking. We then get one of my favorite parts of the whole movie, where we see Elton getting ready to go on stage, and he's being shuffled around by this big team of people, and he looks absolutely miserable until the second he goes on stage, when he goes right into a big winning smile. It's such an incredible bit of acting. And as he gets on stage, he sings to the crowd, "I think it's gonna be a long, long time." He's come to the realization that he's going to be up in space, stuck in this self-destructive lifestyle, for the foreseeable future. It's going to be a long, long time until he can get better. And the crowd, the audience that made him so successful, sings it right back to him. They're affirming what he's saying. And look, I won't lie, the part where he literally takes off into the sky is undeniably goofy. It's a great idea on paper, but not in execution. So it loses points for that, but it immediately gets those points back and then some with the way the scene ends. He takes off into the sky, rising higher and higher until he collides with a jet and this explosion of fireworks, and it immediately cuts to him waking up on that private jet. He's surrounded by smoke, and at first you think, okay, whatever, they're all smoking on the private jet. But it wasn't until like the third or fourth time I watched the movie that I realized the smoke is coming from the top of his head. The top of his head? The top of his head! How do you even think of something like that? Elton's downward spiral is furthered in the Benny and the Jet sequence, where we see him on stage and he's so out of it that he doesn't even know what city he's in. The crowd starts to boo him until he starts singing, and then their attitude completely changes and they all start cheering. Rocketman's depiction of the audiences at these concerts is so interesting. They're completely uninterested and unsupportive unless he's entertaining them. And there's this really cool contrast between the bright white on stage and the deep red of the nightclub. I don't know whose idea it was to turn Benny and the Jets into like a techno club beat, but I hope they got a raise. Also, am I bananas, or is this literally just the Feel Good Inc. music video? Maybe that's just my dumb brain wanting to see Gorillaz references and everything, but they look so similar to me. This scene of Elton in the club is so visually inventive. A lesser film would have used this club scene as an insensitive and heavy-handed way to implicitly demonize homosexuality and promiscuity. But Rocketman doesn't do that. Showing Elton crowd surfing through the sea of bodies is such an interesting way to convey his sex addiction. He's being shuffled around by a group of people just like in the Rocketman scene. This movie is overall a really compelling and understanding portrayal of addiction. It's honestly impressive how this movie is able to take a figure like Elton John, a famous rock star whose lifestyle I assume most of us have very little in common with, and tell an immensely relatable story. I should also mention that this movie is edited in a way that I really like, especially in its transitions from scene to scene.
What have you got to do to get a fucking drink round here, eh?
Just a few examples of good editing I was thinking about for no reason. Hey, look, a Queen record! By the way, Victim of Love is so good. Like, I'm talking about the original. I don't know a lot about this album. From what I understand, it's kind of like Elton John's Hot Space, but I love the title track, and I wish the version that Taron sings in the movie had been on the movie soundtrack. There's a deleted scene from this portion of the movie where Elton discovers that someone in his circle has AIDS, which leads to him getting tested. We then see him in rehab saying that he has no idea how he didn't get it, that he got lucky because he knew so many people who didn't make it. I think if this scene had been left in, it would have made the ending text about his future AIDS organization make more sense, because as is, it feels kind of out of nowhere, especially considering everything else mentioned ties directly back to events of the film. There are a ton of deleted scenes and extended versions of existing scenes that I think should have been included, mostly just because I really like them.
What are you doing?
Trying to kill myself.
I understand why they were cut though. I think that one in particular would have really cheapened the emotional significance of later events in the film. And then we have sorry seems to be the hardest word. This scene is probably one of the most devastating in the entire movie. First of all, I love a good mirror scene in any movie. I don't really know or understand anything about how film is supposed to work, but I've always thought it was such a good way to get into the mindset of a character. It's also kind of an excuse for actors to really flex those dramatic muscles. Rocketman has not one, not two, but 3 mirror scenes, and they're all incredible. It's in these scenes, with no dialogue whatsoever, where Taron Egerton's performance really shines. What I really appreciate about this movie's version of Elton is that he's allowed to be kind of a dick. He can be selfish, he has anger issues, he pushes away the only person who really cares about him, but it's done in a way that feels authentic. Taron plays it off in such a way that you're rooting for him no matter what. You really feel for him in scenes like this where he's just emoting in front of a mirror. There's also something so special about a character who's constantly wearing sunglasses, using their sunglasses to hide their tears. I also want to point out this movie's sound design because it's really cool. For example, in the sorry seems to be the hardest word scene, the music gets louder when Elton opens the bathroom doors. In Honky Cat, when John Reed is standing on the left side of the screen, you hear him singing on the left side. In Rocketman, the instrumentation sounds so out there and spacey, and for the first half, it sounds like you're underwater, because Elton is underwater. Just a few examples of good sound editing and mixing I was thinking about for no reason. I also like the way this movie combines two separate dinners and confrontations Elton is having with different people in his life. The way they're placed back to back really makes you feel like he just can't catch a break. And the way that other people in the restaurant are commenting on the situation through song, like a chorus in a Shakespeare play, it's insane. It's a sad, sad situation. And I completely understand why Dexter Fletcher decided against any cameos in this scene because it would have been so out of place. And again, when Elton sits back down at the table, the crowd turns away from him the second he stops singing, turning a blind eye to his problems. And all of a sudden, I'm crying my eyes out over a guy ordering dessert. The center of the movie is undoubtedly Elton and Bernie's friendship, and this scene is the best example of that. Things are tense between the two of them, and you completely understand why. From Elton's perspective, Bernie abandoned him when he needed him most. But from Bernie's perspective, Elton is committed to destroying himself, and at a certain point, there's nothing Bernie can do. He's been forced to watch his friend spiral deeper and deeper into this self-imposed misery and isolation. We've seen this spiral framed throughout the movie as a journey into space, and here, during Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, we get the culmination of that metaphor, with Bernie asking Elton, "When are you gonna come down? When are you going to land?" It fits so perfectly that you would think these songs were written for the movie. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road is the direct opposite of Honky Cat. Honky Cat is a song about someone leaving his farm and moving to the city, and in the movie, it's a song about Elton leaving his old self behind and embracing his fame, with all the excess that comes with it. Goodbye Yellow Brick Road is a song about someone leaving the city and going back to his farm. In Rocketman, it's a song about Bernie and later Elton rejecting the fame and excess of their current lives and making the choice to do what's right for themselves. And again, the lyrics are changed, or rather rearranged, to better suit this narrative. The verses are flipped so that Bernie is the one to sing the line, "Maybe you'll get a replacement," which is so fitting because earlier in the movie, Elton had told Bernie he wanted to work with other writers. After his verse, Bernie leaves for good, and Elton is completely alone. There's another great acting moment here where Elton has this big outburst and then retreats back into himself like a child. All of his efforts have finally paid off. He's completely miserable, nearly dead, and isolated from everyone who cares about him. And this is when he makes the decision to go to rehab. And this is one of the things I love most about the entire movie. It may seem small, but it's not. Elton is the one who decides to get better because he wants better for himself. He was influenced by Bernie, of course, but he makes the choice alone because the choice is his alone to make. No external circumstance or influence will be enough to push you to recover if you don't want to recover. You have to want better for yourself. And that is what makes Rocketman so special to me, because that is a lesson I really needed to learn. We get one more musical number, I'm Still Standing, where Taron is edited into footage of the real music video. It's a cool choice that kind of bridges the gap between fantasy and reality, but I honestly think it would have looked better if they just recreated the video from scratch. We end on the classic biopic cliche of just a bunch of text. They play Don't Go Breaking My Heart during the credits, which is really funny to me because so does Chicken Little. At least Rocketman has a reason, but Chicken Little was my favorite movie as a kid. I know, I'm sorry. I just think it's a neat connection. And that's Rocketman. And there are a ton of things I left out. I can't cover everything. What was supposed to be a quick run-through of some fun movie details has now taken up the bulk of the runtime. Even though this section has been full of spoilers, I still don't want to spoil the film's most important emotional moments because again, you really should just watch the movie even if you've seen it before. I notice something new every time I watch it, which is often. I love this movie. If I can convince just 10 people to watch Rocketman, then that's enough for me. It's not a perfect film, not even close, but it just hits close to home for me for a number of reasons, and I think it's a very well-told story that was clearly a labor of love, and that alone puts it head and shoulders above any other biopic released in the past decade. It feels like ever since maybe October 24th, 2018 or so, we've seen an exponential rise in unoriginal, uninspired biopics about literally anyone who's ever made music. The most recent example being Back to Black, which is so infuriatingly exploitative that I refuse to give it any more attention than I just did. I think there's something very sinister about these biopics that peddle false narratives about people who aren't around to defend themselves. What makes Rocketman stand out is the fact that Elton John is still alive. He had control over the story being told and the way he was depicted, but that's also kind of a gamble because his involvement could have completely ruined the movie. He could have been overly restrictive and controlling over the way that he was depicted, and the film would have suffered because of it. We've seen that happen before. But he wasn't. He was insistent that the movie be rated R, and he encouraged Taron to make the character of Elton his own, which led to a more compelling and impactful story, an electric lead performance, and a real-life friendship between Elton and Taron. They recorded a song together, they've performed live multiple times, and they clearly have a mutual respect for each other's work. I think this is also what made the Weird Al movie work so well. Weird Al is still alive and is also a deeply unserious person, and the film clearly reflects that. At least I've heard it does. I haven't actually seen it. I want to, but that's just because Quinta Brunson is in it. I would say that I love her and that she created my favorite TV show of all time, but at this point I'm hesitant to praise any former BuzzFeed employee. And I think Dexter Fletcher deserves more recognition for this movie. Even though the other elements of the film are very strong, the project could have completely fallen apart with a different director at the helm. His direction is what makes the movie so special, and he deserves credit for it. I almost feel like he's better known for the film he technically didn't direct than the one he did. Hopefully in the future, Rocketman will be able to get out from under the thumb of all the other biopics released around the same time, especially a certain biopic that I didn't mention in this video, not even once. Rocketman is one of my favorite films of all time, and it deserves so much more recognition. I think it was ultimately a victim of circumstance. Because of the time in which it came out and the genre it's a part of, it just couldn't have succeeded to the extent it deserved to. It didn't break any box office records, but it was the first film from a major studio to include a gay sex scene, and that should tell you everything you need to know. It's stunning, it's inspiring, it's Rocketman, and it's criminally underrated. Okay, so I'm finally done talking about Rocketman, at least for now, which means there's only one thing left to do. Thank you for watching the very first episode of Criminally Underrated Media. Hopefully I've convinced you to watch or re-watch Rocketman. I'm sorry if this video was a little messy or hard to follow. Sometimes I just get a little too excited about whatever it is I'm talking about. I swear to God, this video was supposed to be like 20 minutes long. Think of this video as kind of a pilot episode. I promise these videos will only get better and more streamlined as time goes on, so stick around. Also, thank you for watching my previous video. I never expected it to take off the way it did. If you subscribed because of that video, it really means the world to me, and thank you for watching this video. Now you know what I sound like when I'm happy and I like things. Let me know down in the comments what you would like to see me cover in a future episode, and I will see you in the next one. Oh, that's dumb.
This right here is my swag. All the girls are on me. Damn, everybody pay attention. This right here is my pretty boy swag. Pretty boy swag.